On July the 17th, 1918, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were brutally executed by communist revolutionaries. Only 2 years earlier, Nicholas had been the absolute ruler of the entire Russian Empire and one of the most powerful men in the world. Nicholas had lost his throne and his life in the events that we now refer to as the Russian Revolution. The Tsarist regime that had ruled Russia for centuries was overthrown and the empire descended into anarchy and civil war. Russia had been one of the last absolute monarchies in Europe, with the Tsar having essentially total power. That then begs the question, to what extent was Nicholas himself to blame for the fall of his regime? Did the revolution happen because of decisions that he made, or was he simply in an impossible situation that nobody would have been able to manage? What could he have done differently that might have helped him retain his throne? In this video, I'm going to talk all about the terrible decisions that Nicholas made, how he really was his own worst enemy. However, before that, let's have a brief overview of the history, the story of the Russian Revolution. Before that, I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play online multiplayer game where you and your teammates command a huge navy and go into battle against the enemy fleet. The game is very realistic, allowing you to get a sense of what it would have been like to participate in one of those battles. Each ship is modeled extremely accurately on historical ships, so as you play you will learn about some of the most iconic vessels of history. Weather effects make each battle unique and change the tactics that you'll need to use to win. New content is released every month, whether it's new ships, nations, classes or cosmetics. World of Warships is also available on console. Download World of Warships by using the link in the description. During registration, use the promo code BRAVO to receive a huge starter pack including 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time and a free ship after you complete 15 battles. In the late 1800s, Russia was one of the most powerful nations on earth, with an enormous population and landmass. However, the country also had some huge problems. The first was that it was far less developed than the other nations of the age. Countries like Britain and Germany were racing ahead with industrialization, making the most of new technologies to become ever more productive and wealthy. In Russia, by contrast, the adoption of new technologies was slow and most of the population was still peasants working the land with outdated farming techniques. Another major problem was terrorism, with assassination attempts happening constantly. In fact, one Tsar was actually killed in a terrorist bombing in 1881. Nicholas II inherited the throne in 1894 after the sudden death of his father. Nicholas knew the magnitude of what awaited him. When his father died, he turned to his brother-in-law and asked him, "What am I going to do? What is going to happen to me, to you, to Russia? I'm not ready to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one." Ultimately, Nicholas had no choice. He was now the Tsar of the Russian Empire. The first few years of Nicholas's reign weren't especially eventful. He married a German princess, Alexandra Feodorovna, who he had been in love with for years. Alexandra would go on to play a crucial role in politics and decision-making. At the time that Nicholas came to power, most of the countries of Europe were gradually moving towards democracy and decreasing the power of their monarchs. However, from the very start of his reign, Nicholas was extremely hostile to the idea of any form of democratic rule and determined that Russia would remain an absolute monarchy. He declared, "I will devote all my strength to maintain, for the good of the whole nation, the principle of absolute autocracy." However, many people in Russia hated the Tsarist regime and wanted the country to liberalize and become more democratic. People were angry about the astonishing levels of inequality. The majority of the population barely had enough to eat, while the richest in society led lives of incredible extravagance and luxury. That resentment eventually boiled over into mass protests in 1905. It started as a strike by steelworkers in the capital, which then escalated to over 100,000 men from 400 factories refusing to work. Within weeks, there was no electricity and all public areas were closed. The capital had ground to a halt. Eventually, tens of thousands of protesters marched to the Winter Palace to give the Tsar a petition asking for better working conditions and more political rights. The situation got out of hand and panicked troops fired on the protesters, killing hundreds. That massacre, which came to be known as Bloody Sunday, would go on to spark a revolution. All over the Russian Empire, workers began to go on strike. Throughout the next few months, roughly half of workers in European Russia went on strike, and more than 90% in Russian-occupied Poland. One of the biggest effects of Bloody Sunday was on the press, which now began to ignore censorship rules. Publications openly criticised the regime and called for a constitution that would protect political rights. That was against everything that Nicholas stood for. Just the previous year he had stated, "I shall never agree to a representative form of government because I consider it harmful to the people whom God has trusted in my care." Unfortunately for Nicholas, events were getting out of his control. The strikes were grinding the country to a halt and political violence was rampant. In fact, in February, Nicholas's own uncle was assassinated. Something that made the situation even more difficult was that while all that was happening, Russia was actually losing a war against Japan. Russia had been at war with Japan since February of 1904, when Japan launched a surprise attack at Port Arthur in modern-day China. The Russian military performed extremely badly in the war and was eventually forced to sign a humiliating peace in September of 1905. That poor performance in the war meant that there was discontent in the military, making it much less willing to put down the political unrest at home. Eventually, in October, the strikes became so bad that the country was barely functioning. The Tsar had no choice but to accept some of the people's demands. He was forced to publish the October Manifesto, which was essentially a constitution. It granted basic civil rights, allowed for political parties, and increased suffrage. Most importantly, it introduced a parliament known as the Duma. Nicholas bitterly resisted being forced to accept the document, saying that he felt sick with shame to betray his dynasty. The people, on the other hand, were ecstatic. There were mass demonstrations in support of the constitution, and all the strikes effectively ended overnight. In May of the next year, the constitution was ratified and the first parliament opened. The new representatives began proposing legislation that was far more radical than anything that the Tsarist regime was going to accept. One example was a reform to agricultural law, which was strongly opposed by landlords. Nicholas had always been hostile to the parliament, and eventually, after only 73 days, he dissolved it, exclaiming, "Curse the Duma." Elections were then held again for the parliament. This time, even more radicals were voted in. It was becoming clear that the new parliament was going to remain a thorn in Nicholas's side. Eventually, he dissolved it again and arrested some of the most radical members. Another election was held, but this time Nicholas changed the rules to ensure that there would be fewer radicals and more conservatives. That third parliament would actually last the full 5 years. The next major event in Nicholas's reign was the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Russia would perform extremely badly in the war, and within 2 years it had lost an enormous amount of territory and huge numbers of men. Within Russia itself, the economy was badly affected, leading to inflation and a big increase in poverty. That ultimately led to another uprising in March of 1917. Like with the previous revolution, it started out as strikes, which quickly got out of control. Nicholas initially ignored the situation. The head of the parliament, Rodzianko, sent him a telegram saying, "The situation is serious. The capital is in a state of anarchy. The government is paralyzed. Transport service and the supply of food and fuel have become completely disrupted. General discontent is growing. There must be no delay. Any procrastination is tantamount to death." You would hope that Nicholas would respond by immediately rushing to St. Petersburg to try to calm the situation. Instead, he responded by dissolving the Duma and calling Rodzianko fat. He said, "Again, this fat Rodzianko has sent me some nonsense, to which I shall not even bother to reply." Over the next few days, the protests gradually grew and grew until hundreds of thousands were in the streets. Some of the protesters were carrying placards that read, "Down with the Tsar." The troops in the city were ordered to quell the unrest, but they refused and joined the protesters. The government had lost control of the capital. Gradually, the Tsar's closest advisors began to realize that the only way to restore order was for Nicholas to abdicate. Together, they pressured him to abdicate, and he did on the 15th of March 1917. The plan was that the throne would be taken by Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. However, Michael wasn't consulted and refused to take the throne. With that one final act of incompetence, Nicholas had ended his dynasty and made Russia a republic. Nicholas lived for another year as essentially a prisoner of the revolution. Eventually, on the 17th of July 1918, he and his family were executed by communist revolutionaries. The fall of the Tsarist regime was complete. So, that is what happened, the execution of Nicholas and the fall of the Tsarist regime. That then raises the question of how much Nicholas was to blame. Did he make decisions that contributed to his downfall? Well, the first mistake that he made was trying to hold on to too much power. At the time that Nicholas became Tsar, much of Europe was liberalizing, expanding suffrage and becoming more democratic. Nicholas was absolutely determined that Russia wouldn't follow that same path, wanting Russia to remain an absolute monarchy with total power in his hands. That alienated him from the public, who were desperate to have more representation and more political rights. One of the biggest problems with the absolute monarchy was that it kept in place Russia's eye-watering inequality. The majority of the population were peasants that worked the fields day and night. They received little in exchange for their labour, and it was the lord of the manor that would reap the rewards. In truth, they led lives that were not much better than slavery. Meanwhile, the nobles led lives of gratuitous extravagance and luxury. In this amazing clip, a woman who was part of one of those noble families talks about the ostentatious life that they had.
When there were big dinner parties, we could have 600 people to dinner because the winter garden was enormous and it gave onto the dining room. And of course there were palm trees there and all kinds. It was only here that somebody said to me, well, what happened when those palm trees grew to the ceilings? And my sister said, well, didn't you know they used to lift the roof up? They never cut the palm trees, just let them grow on.
That meant that the elites were totally out of touch with what life was like for the majority of the population, and Nicholas himself was no exception. For his predecessors, even the idea of caring about something called public opinion would have seemed absurd. It was only in the early 1900s that the idea was being had that the Russian government should actually try to make life better for ordinary people, and as you can imagine, not much was done. For example, conditions in Russian factories were absolutely terrible, with workers being forced to work up to 18 hours a day in extremely dangerous conditions. The lodgings where workers would sleep were extremely overcrowded, with large numbers of people forced to share the same room. In the summer, the insects became so numerous that some workers chose to sleep outside. Some factories didn't even have a dedicated space to sleep. The workers had to sleep on the factory floor. In 1886, the government made a half-hearted attempt to improve conditions by creating a new ministry that would inspect factories to ensure that the conditions were humane and lawful. However, the law was quickly undermined by corruption. The business community used their connections in the government to get rid of any inspectors that they didn't like. In 1897, another law was passed to try to strengthen workers' rights further, but it was still a long way away from the standards of the rest of Europe. The working day remained 11.5 hours. As you can imagine, ordinary people were desperate for change, but they had no political representation, and so resentment built up over time. If Nicholas had been more willing to share power with a parliament whose job it was to represent the interests of ordinary Russians, better legislation would likely have been passed. Then, potentially, the lives of ordinary people would have improved, so they wouldn't have had so much resentment. With no political outlets, people resorted to strikes to try to make their demands heard. In December of 1904, workers at the Putilov factory in St. Petersburg went on strike, and over the next few days, workers in hundreds of other factories joined them. Within weeks, about 150,000 workers were on strike, and the city had no electricity. Then, in January, a priest led a group of workers to the Winter Palace to give the Tsar a petition. Troops from the palace fired on the crowd, killing hundreds in a massacre that would go on to be remembered as Bloody Sunday. That was the beginning of the 1905 revolution. What would follow were months of strikes and protests that would bring Russia to a standstill. It's important to note that Nicholas himself didn't order the massacre. In fact, he wasn't even in the city at the time. However, his handling of the strikes and protests do deserve some criticism. The angry population wouldn't really have been that hard to placate. In fact, many of their demands were relatively modest. People wanted things like universal education, freedom of speech and religion, and an 8-hour working day. I think if Nicholas had met the demands just halfway, the unrest would probably have ended and he would have been extremely popular. However, as was typical of Nicholas, he was absolutely determined to concede as little as possible. On March the 2nd, about 2 months after the unrest had started, he did agree to the creation of a parliament, but it wasn't to have any real power, only an advisory role. That wasn't enough to placate the protesters, and so for the next few months Russia was in a state of near anarchy. The state lost control of some regions as the peasants rebelled. There were constant strikes which brought the country to a standstill. As you can imagine, it was the perfect environment for revolutionaries to build their networks and accrue power. By allowing all that to continue, Nicholas was really playing with fire, allowing his nation to teeter on the verge of collapse. It was only in October, after about 9 months of chaos, that he finally agreed to more of the public's demands, a real parliament and a written constitution. That did go a long way to reduce the chaos and allowed the government to start to get the country back under its control. One of the reasons that the unrest of 1905 was so bad was because it was happening at the same time as Russia's disastrous war with Japan, and Nicholas certainly deserves a share of the blame for that. First, he contributed to the war happening in the first place. For decades, Russia and Japan had both been expanding into Asia, which was causing tension between the two. Both countries wanted to control Korea and Manchuria, and war was very clearly on the horizon. Something that's interesting is that the Japanese were actually eager to avoid a war. They wanted to make an agreement where Russia took Manchuria and Japan took Korea. In fact, in 1901, one of the most important Japanese statesmen visited the Russian capital with the hope of making a deal. The Russians treated him extremely badly, pretty much ignoring him, and eventually, after months of humiliation, he left. For the next few years, Japanese envoys continued to try to get a meeting with the Russian Tsar and make a deal, but they were all treated with contempt. That was because Nicholas viewed the Japanese as beneath him because they were Asian and therefore inferior. Eventually, after years of trying to find a diplomatic solution, the Japanese gave up and chose war. Nicholas's arrogance was about to get Russia into a war that could easily have been avoided and would turn out to be an absolute disaster for Russia. It started when Japan launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur in February of 1904, and over the next few months it won several key battles. The war was extremely difficult for Russia to fight effectively since it was taking place so far away from the Russian heartland. After months of defeats, losing the war was looking ever more likely, and so Nicholas decided on a crazy course of action to try to save it. The Russian navy in the Far East was very weak, and so Nicholas decided to send the much stronger Baltic fleet all the way around the world to fight. The fleet would go all the way around the tip of Africa and then into Asia. The idea was always extremely risky, and the higher-ups in the navy were against it. The logistics of the journey would be extremely difficult, as the ships would require 500,000 tons of coal. However, Russia didn't have any naval bases along the route that could help it resupply. In the end, they had to ask a favour of Germany to help keep the fleet supplied. Once they got around the tip of Africa, they needed to stop in Madagascar, which was a French colony. France didn't particularly want them to, but did eventually agree. After 7 months at sea in a journey that attracted worldwide attention, the Baltic fleet made it to the Sea of Japan. Nicholas was hoping that the huge Baltic fleet would be able to turn the tide of the war and bring about a glorious victory. In the end, he couldn't have been more wrong, and the Japanese navy obliterated the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. That defeat left Russia totally unable to continue the war and forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty in which it was forced to accept Japanese domination of Korea and Manchuria. Overall, Nicholas deserves a lot of blame for the disaster. He had got Russia into the war through his arrogance of not wanting to negotiate with the Japanese. It was his poor strategy that was then part of the reason that Russia lost. Over the next few years, Russia muddled on with its new constitution and parliament. As was typical of Nicholas, he continued to try to hold on to as much power as possible and resist any attempts to liberalise. Even though the parliament was extremely popular with the people, Nicholas did everything he could to undermine it and reduce its power. The first parliament opened in April of 1906, and it immediately began proposing reforms that would liberalise the country. Most importantly, they wanted to redistribute land, taking it from the rich and giving it to the poor. Nicholas was scared of the proposed reforms and decided to dissolve the parliament after only 73 days. The leader of the largest party was so enraged by Nicholas's actions that he issued an appeal for civil disobedience, telling the people to evade taxes and refuse conscription. Nicholas had him and his fellow deputies arrested. A new parliament met in February of the next year, and it was in fact even more radical than the first. Nicholas's prime minister accused some members of preparing an armed uprising and demanded their exclusion from parliament. The deputies refused, and so after only 103 days, Nicholas dissolved the second parliament. It would have been easy at that point to totally abandon the idea of having a parliament. However, Nicholas didn't actually want to do that. Instead, he decided to change the voting rules before a new parliament was elected. From then on, there would be more representation given to landowners and the rich, and less to the peasants. The third parliament met in November of 1907, and given the new election rules, it was much more conservative than the previous one. That parliament did last the full 5-year term, and Nicholas managed to achieve some degree of cooperation with it. Overall, Nicholas's relationship with the parliament shows us his complete unwillingness to share power and liberalise. If he had been more willing to share power, he would have made himself far less hated. Together with the Duma, he might have been able to pass better legislation that would have actually improved the economy and the lives of his people. Another big mistake for Nicholas throughout that period was that he didn't prepare Russia for war, meaning that when World War I broke out in 1914, Russia was severely lacking in equipment. In fact, the situation was so bad that some men didn't even have rifles or ammunition. The main reason for that was that Russia's military-industrial complex was not as developed as that of other nations, such as Britain or France. The other European nations had much more advanced industrial sectors that were able to produce large amounts of military products. The Russian government had a deep hostility towards private enterprise, which meant that war preparation relied mainly on state-owned factories rather than private industry. All that meant that when war broke out in 1914, the Russian military couldn't get anywhere near as much equipment as it needed. One of Nicholas's biggest mistakes in that regard was his choice of war minister, Vladimir Sukhomlinov. Sukhomlinov failed to keep Russia up to date with changes in warfare, proudly stating, "I have not read a military manual in the last 25 years." Sukhomlinov was an incredibly incompetent man, described by one British official as a light-hearted man, characterized by his enemies as a buffoon, whose influence over the emperor is ascribed to his fund of excellent stories. Essentially, Sukhomlinov had his position because the Tsar liked him, even though his incompetence was well known. It is the perfect example of Nicholas being terrible at managing his court and choosing bad advisors to surround him. For all that Nicholas made bad decisions when it came to his governance of Russia, it was in fact his mistakes in foreign policy that would finally see the end of his reign. A good example of his lack of talent for geopolitics was the Bosnian crisis of 1908. In the early 1900s, the area known as the Balkans was an incredibly delicate balance between Austria and Russia. Centuries prior, the region had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but gradually the Ottomans had got weaker and weaker, and more of that land had become independent. For example, Greece got independence in 1829, Romania got independence in 1878. However, as those colonies broke free from the Ottomans, Russia and Austria immediately began competing to gain influence over them. There was the ever-present threat of war between the two powers if either one tried to expand too much into the region. Then, in 1878, an agreement was reached that just about kept both sides happy. One of the key parts of the arrangement was that Bosnia was on paper part of the Ottoman Empire, but it would be governed by Austria. However, Austria wasn't happy about that. It didn't want to just govern Bosnia, it wanted it to be officially part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1908, Austria decided to annex Bosnia, but first it approached Russia to try to find a way to get Russia's blessing for the annexation. Nicholas's handling of the situation was extremely incompetent and shows what a poor strategist and diplomat he was. He agreed to allow Austria to annex Bosnia, but in exchange he demanded that Austria back Russia's claim to the Dardanelles Strait. Russia had always wanted control of the Dardanelles, as it would allow its Black Sea fleet access to the Mediterranean. The deal was agreed, and in October of 1908, Austria annexed Bosnia. However, it quickly became clear that Nicholas had made a grave error to make the deal. First, it put into jeopardy Russia's alliance with Serbia. Serbia was extremely strongly against the Austrian annexation of Bosnia, so when Russia backed it, Serbia felt betrayed. The fact that the Russians had given it the go-ahead made the Serbs far less trusting of Russia. That meant that in order to maintain the alliance with Serbia, Russia needed to be far more committed to it, with more overt displays of support. The problem with that was that it alienated another of Russia's allies in the area, Bulgaria. Bulgaria and Serbia had extremely bad relations, so when Russia began to give more support to Serbia, it worsened relations with Bulgaria. Overall, backing the Austrian annexation had damaged Russia's relationships with two important allies in the region. You would hope that Russia would get something really valuable in exchange for that loss, but in the end, Russia got absolutely nothing out of the deal. Nicholas's plan to try to use the deal to get the Dardanelles totally failed because he completely misjudged the situation. Austria did back Russia's claim to the Dardanelles, but their support was worthless. Austria was in no position to give Russia permission to take the Straits, as all the other great powers of Europe were also against it. The fact that Austria was now backing Russia's claim to the Strait was meaningless. Overall, Nicholas had damaged Russia's relationships with two allies in the Balkans and got absolutely nothing in return. Really, Nicholas should just have refused Austria permission to do the annexation. I think it's unlikely that Austria would have dared to do it without Russian permission. If Austria did still go ahead without Russia's authorization, Nicholas should have appealed to the other European powers, particularly Germany, to condemn the annexation. The other powers were not in favor of Austria taking Bosnia. In fact, Germany only agreed to it precisely because Russia agreed to it. If Russia had condemned the annexation and appealed to the other great powers to do the same, Austria would have come off looking extremely bad, and it might have weakened its relationship with its ally Germany. Overall, Nicholas played his cards extremely badly. Nicholas's lack of talent for geopolitics was on full display again a few years later during the Balkan Wars. The Balkan Wars were extremely complicated, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but essentially in the First Balkan War, 4 of the former Ottoman colonies formed an alliance against the Ottoman Empire to completely drive it out of the region. Nicholas played a key role in bringing the alliance about because he thought it would give him influence over those countries. Initially, it seemed like the plan had worked when the Balkan alliance consisting of Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia and Montenegro defeated the Ottomans and managed to drive them out of the region. However, Nicholas's plan then blew up in his face the next year. Having helped those nations defeat the Ottomans, Nicholas had thought that he would have influence over them, but in fact they turned out to be uncontrollable. Bulgaria wanted to expand its borders further and attacked Serbia, starting the Second Balkan War. Given that Bulgaria was the aggressor, Nicholas had no choice but to support Serbia, leaving relations between Bulgaria and Russia irreparably damaged. Russia was left with Serbia as its only ally in the Balkans. Once again, Nicholas had tried his hand at geopolitics and ended up with his fingers burnt. In my view, the biggest mistake that Nicholas made in his whole life was getting Russia involved in World War I. Now, to be clear, Russia was not the only country to be blamed for the outbreak of the war. I have actually made a video all about who was to blame and what each country contributed to that totally avoidable war. The conclusion that I have come to over time is that Serbia and Austria share a lot of blame for starting a conflict between themselves, and Germany and Russia share a lot of blame for escalating that local conflict into a European war. For those that aren't familiar with the story, essentially a Serbian nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was of course outraged by the assassination of their heir, but they weren't sure how to respond. Should they go to war with Serbia? If not, what should they do? Germany was allied with Austria and promised to back it, whatever it chose to do. Russia was allied with Serbia and promised to defend Serbia should Austria go to war. Eventually, Austria decided that it would send Serbia an ultimatum. Serbia must either accept various humiliating demands or Austria would invade. On the 23rd of July, almost 4 weeks after the assassination, the ultimatum was sent. The Serbians agreed to some, but not all, of the ultimatum, and so 5 days later, Austria declared war. The next day, it began shelling the Serbian capital. At the same time, Russia, fearing attack from Austria and Germany, began readying its military. That process, known as mobilization, was hugely provocative to Germany. Fearing Russian attack, Germany issued an ultimatum demanding that Russia stop mobilizing. Russia refused, and so Germany declared war. With Russia and Germany at war, another great power was drawn into the conflict, France. France was allied with Russia, and so it also had to declare war on Germany. With Germany threatened on both sides, it decided to attack France, hoping for a fast victory that would allow it to then divert its military towards Russia. Attacking France required going through Belgium, and that provoked Britain. After German troops advanced into Belgium, Britain declared war. With that, World War I had started. Now, there are numerous things that Russia did to contribute to that escalation, and Nicholas, being the man at the top, ultimately bears at least some responsibility. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, Russia did various things to inflame the situation. First, it gave full backing to Serbia and gave no sympathy at all to Austria. It even claimed that Serbia wasn't involved in the assassination, which it knew wasn't really true. That was at a time when Austria had already produced evidence showing that Serbia was involved. Essentially, the Russians were accusing the Austrians of fabricating evidence. They were implying that Austria was taking advantage of the assassinations as a pretext to attack Serbia because they wanted to annex it. Essentially, according to Russia, Austria didn't have the right to do anything in response to the assassination. The Russians didn't even accept Austrian demands for an investigation in Serbia. The Austrian ambassador merely mentioned the possibility that Austria would demand that Serbia help with an investigation. The Russian foreign minister responded by warning him that that would make a very bad impression in Russia. In his words, Austria should drop the idea, lest they set foot upon a dangerous path. The extent to which Russia was supporting Serbia was extremely reckless and inflammatory. The Russian foreign minister actually stated that Russia would not remain inactive if the dignity and integrity of the Serb people, brothers in blood, were under threat. Russia's support for Serbia was even more egregious because it actually knew that Serbia was involved in the assassination. Its claims to the contrary were pure deceit. Something else that massively fanned the flames was a newspaper article published on the 13th of June. Its headline read, "We are ready, France must be ready too." It was widely reprinted in the French and German press. The article painted a picture of a mighty Russian war machine ready to fall upon Germany. The Russian army would soon have 2.3 million men, more than Germany and Austria combined. Also, thanks to the rail network, mobilization times were plummeting. As you can imagine, the Germans were extremely alarmed. All that said, by far the biggest thing that Russia did to escalate the situation was to mobilize its military. The significance of that can't be overstated. For us now, it's easy to think that just preparing one's military is a reasonable thing to do. To have the army ready doesn't necessarily mean that a country is going to attack. However, given military thinking at the time, mobilization was extremely provocative. At the time, it was generally believed that whichever nation was able to get their army to the battlefield first would win. In the Franco-Prussian War, for example, Prussia defeated France in large part by getting its army to the field first. That meant that when Russia mobilized, it was extremely difficult for Germany not to mobilize out of fear that Russia would strike first and win a decisive victory. It was essentially a situation where the game theory led to incentives that made it harder to avoid war. Russia was the first nation to go into general mobilization. Even Austria-Hungary was only in partial mobilization against Serbia at that point. The German government hadn't even declared a state of impending war, a level below mobilization. Given that Nicholas was the absolute monarch of Russia, he was indirectly culpable for all that Russia did to bring about World War I. He himself was also directly involved in some of the escalation. For example, he urged the Serbs to be more bellicose, telling them to quote-unquote fight like lions. It was also his decision to mobilize. The idea to mobilize wasn't Nicholas's, but of course he did need to sign off on the order. That decision was such a huge escalation that the German emperor actually sent Nicholas a telegram begging him not to mobilize. Nicholas did in fact consider the request, but in the end he went ahead with the mobilization. 2 days later, the Germans sent the Russians an ultimatum saying that if they didn't demobilize, Germany would declare war. It was one last attempt by the Germans to maintain peace. Nicholas had one last opportunity to avoid the war that would bring down his regime. Once again, Nicholas considered backing down, but ultimately decided to go ahead with the mobilization, knowing that it would mean war with Germany. In my view, for Nicholas to contribute to the onset of a European war like that was absolutely insane. That's not just from the point of view of all of us that wish that the war had never happened. Even from his own point of view, it was absolute madness. He should have known how weak his regime and the Russian military were and seen war for the grave threat that it was. You have to remember that World War I broke out in 1914, which is only 9 years after the twin disasters of the defeat against Japan and the First Revolution. Both of those events should have been massive signals that Nicholas should try to avoid war at all costs. The defeat against Japan should have shown Nicholas just how weak the Russian military was. It had been thrashed by a nation which had nothing like the military prestige of Germany. The revolution of 1905 should have shown Nicholas how weak his regime was politically. Russia had been brought to its knees by strikes, protests and uprisings. It had been on the verge of anarchy. Nicholas had lost control to such an extent that he had been forced to give up his absolute power. In the years after, Russia had almost been in a state of civil war. The government's control of the country had been very tenuous. All that is to say that in 1914, when war with Germany was on the horizon, it would only have taken a modicum of common sense for Nicholas to know that it was a massive threat to him and he should do absolutely everything in his power to avoid it. Interestingly, the Parliament was actually against getting involved in the war, seeing it for the disaster that it was likely to be. They advised Nicholas to stay out of the war, but as ever, he ignored them. While getting involved in the war was the biggest mistake that Nicholas made, the reason that it was such a disastrous decision was because of how badly the Russian military performed during the war. In fact, I've actually done a whole video all about how poor the Russian military was. Again, Nicholas, being the man at the top, does bear some responsibility. One of the reasons that Russia performed so badly was that Nicholas hadn't prepared the country for war. As I mentioned earlier, he chose the extremely incompetent Vladimir Sokolnikov to be his war minister. Even once the war was underway and Sokolnikov's incompetence was clearly visible, Nicholas delayed in replacing him. It was only in 1915, 1 year into the war, that Nicholas found a new war minister. Sokolnikov was then actually tried for treason because of how much he had hampered the Russian war effort. Another big error that Nicholas made during the war was his decision to make himself supreme commander of the military. There were many problems with Nicholas doing that, one of the most obvious being that he didn't have any direct military experience. The cabinet was almost unanimously against it, but Nicholas ignored them and did it anyway. Nicholas likely did it because he liked being on the front amongst military men where he received more respect than he got from the civilian government in the capital. One of the biggest issues with Nicholas making himself supreme commander is that it meant that it was impossible for him to avoid blame for the war going badly. When he wasn't officially in charge, all of the Russian losses could be blamed on the military, and it could be argued that it wasn't Nicholas's fault. With Nicholas as supreme commander, all anger was directed at him. Another problem was that it left a power vacuum in the capital, with Nicholas's wife left to govern the country. That was a problem because she was extremely unpopular. She was German-born, so many in the population believed that she actually wanted Germany to win the war and was working to undermine the Russian war effort. That was completely untrue, but many people believed it. She was also unpopular because of her advisor, the infamous mystic and faith healer Rasputin. Rasputin had a terrible reputation. Many people thought that he was a serial rapist. Needless to say, much of the public hated the fact that he was so close to the seat of power. Some believed that he had put a spell on the Tsarina. Others believed that they were having an affair. Either way, it was terrible for the popularity of the royal family. As well as being unpopular, the Tsarina also made some terrible decisions. One of the worst was firing the one competent war minister that Russia had during the war, Alexei Polivanov. I mentioned earlier the incredibly incompetent war minister, Sokolnikov. Well, when he was fired, he was replaced by Polivanov, who began to turn things around. Polivanov was far more competent and professional than his predecessor. He could communicate well, both with military and political figures, meaning that for the first and only time there was some degree of coordination. He also did a great job of sorting out the problems in logistics and training. Unfortunately, Polivanov was going to be fired for the most trivial of reasons. It was in part because he'd been critical of Rasputin, saying that it was inappropriate for such a shady figure to have so much power. He had also been one of the people that urged Nicholas not to make himself supreme commander of the military, seeing that it would be a disaster. That led him to fall out of favour with the Tsarina, and so she dismissed him in March of 1916. That stupid decision cost Russia the best war minister that it would have throughout the entire war. The last thing that I would like to talk about are Nicholas's errors during the revolution of March 1917, the revolution that would finally end his reign and his dynasty. After 2.5 years of fighting, World War I would turn out to be a strain that the Russian state simply couldn't bear. By early 1917, the Russian public was sick of the hardship of war, which caused chronic shortages, most importantly of bread. Eventually, in March, workers started to go on strike, and the situation quickly got out of control. Before long, the government had lost control of the capital. Here again, we see examples of the incompetence and foolishness of Nicholas. His first mistake was to not take the threat seriously enough. There had been many similar incidents that turned out to be nothing, and Nicholas assumed that this was just more of the same. Even when the head of the parliament was begging him to return to the capital as soon as possible, Nicholas simply ignored him. Nicholas actually dissolved the parliament, even though he wasn't personally there to take control of events. With the parliament dissolved, there was a power vacuum in the capital, and he wasn't there to fill it. Another terrible mistake that Nicholas made was to not have his most loyal troops stationed there. In previous uprisings, the fiercely loyal Cossacks had quelled the unrest, but this time they disobeyed his orders. Given that Russia was in such a precarious state at the time, it should have been clear to Nicholas that he needed the most loyal soldiers that he could find guarding the capital. In the end, the garrison betrayed him. The last error that Nicholas made was to abdicate to his brother without first consulting him. Had Nicholas known that his brother would refuse the throne, then perhaps he would have been able to persuade his generals to allow him to stay on. Perhaps the throne could have been taken by his son with a regent to act on his behalf. It's easy to assume that that wouldn't have made a difference to the eventual outcome of events, but I think we can't be so sure. If there was still a member of the royal family as official head of state, it might have made the ensuing months less chaotic and potentially reduced the level of division. Perhaps it might have helped the moderates stave off the threat from the far left that ultimately took power. Whatever may have been, that is not what happened. Russia was left without a monarch, and so quite abruptly became a republic. Nicholas lived for about a year after his abdication. He was essentially a broken man with no power and without even the ability to flee Russia. Eventually, he and his family were executed in July of 1918. Overall, I think there can be no doubt that Nicholas was an incredibly inept, incompetent ruler, and his downfall was to a large degree his own doing. There were numerous, totally avoidable mistakes that he made that led him to lose control of his country. His determination to hold on to absolute power was ill-judged, particularly when so much of what he was involved in went so badly wrong. He should have recognized that he didn't know all the answers and that he needed more intelligent, qualified people to make decisions. That said, in my view, the biggest mistake that he made was to get involved in the First World War. It was World War I that tore the Russian military and eventually the government apart. He should have been able to sense that it would be a grave threat, and he should have avoided it and could have done so very easily. When the Germans sent him an ultimatum demanding that Russia not mobilize its military, all that he had to do was accept it. I think it's interesting to compare the fate of Nicholas with that of another monarch who fell to revolution, Louis XVI. Louis XVI was King of France before the French Revolution, and in my view he does deserve a lot of blame for his downfall. Like Nicholas, he also made lots of poor decisions during his reign. That said, I think Nicholas II was even more blameworthy than Louis. Louis inherited a country in a financial crisis. He had no choice but to navigate a very difficult situation. Nicholas, on the other hand, didn't inherit a nation in crisis. In fact, Russia was relatively stable. Louis had to find a way to totally restructure the nation's finances in the face of fierce opposition from the nobility and clergy. All that Nicholas needed to do was to not rock the boat and allow Russia to gradually liberalize in the same way that Britain, France and Germany had done so. Oh, and don't get involved in World War I. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring today's video. Download World of Warships by using the link in the description. During registration, use the promo code BRAVO to receive a huge starter pack including 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time and a free ship after you complete 15 battles.